Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Bobby, Eddy, and David. When Bobby Shafran was 19 years old, he found out he had a twin, a brother named Eddy. The two were raised separately because they had been adopted at birth into different households. Not too long after finding out about each other, things took an even crazier twist when Bobby and Eddy found out that they had a triplet, another brother named David. What should have been a very joyous reunion for the triplets turned very dark when they began to uncover the truth about what happened and why they had spent all of those years not knowing the others existed. As it turns out, they found out they were forced to be subjects of an experiment they had no idea was taking place. Peter Neubauer was a child psychiatrist who wanted to study nature versus nurture, but decided to do it in this cruel and unethical way. He believed that twins or triplets had a better chance of thriving if they were separated from their twin, and he wanted to prove this by unknowingly separating twins from each other at birth. Luckily, Bobby, Eddy, and David all found each other, and their story is documented in the movie Three Identical Strangers. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Milgram Experiment. The premise of this experiment was that they took two groups of people, one called teachers and one called learners, and they paired them up, one from each group. The pair couldn't see each other, but the teacher would ask the learner a question. If the learner got it wrong, the teacher was then told to give them an electric shock. Every question made the shocks get worse until an eventual fatal shock would be administered. Before the experiment, it was proposed that only 3% of the participants would go all of the way and actually give the fatal shock. But it turned out that under pressure, 65% of the teachers actually gave the lethal dose of electricity to their learner counterparts. Luckily, the students were actually just actors, so no one was truly getting hurt or shocked to death in this experiment, but it honestly is very creepy and very disturbing to see these poor people being pushed so far past their boundaries, and it's kind of unsettling to know the results. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Hoffling Hospital Experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966, in a time where the rules of psychological experiments were a lot more loosey-goosey. Because of this, the nurses that were all a part of this experiment had no idea that they were participants, which nowadays is very, very illegal. Basically, this experiment took place on the night shift. The night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be Dr. Smith, who's actually a researcher. He would ask the nurses to check the medicine cabinet to see if they had a drug called Astrotin, which was actually a drug that was just made up for this experiment, and it was just a placebo. The Astrotin would clearly state the maximum dosage of 10 milligrams, but Dr. Smith would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and he would sign all of the authorization papers as soon as he came in to see the patient later on that night. If the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. They are not allowed to accept instructions over the phone, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized. It was not on the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be in use at the hospital. Out of the 22 unknowing nurse participants, 21 of them administered the drug. That's insane. This isn't to say that the nurses were bad people or that they were bad at their job, but this experiment combined with the interviews that happened afterwards just showed how the power imbalance and the social pressures that come along with that can affect the outcome of a workplace extremely drastically, and in this case it really could have been a matter of life and death. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Facial Expressions Experiment. In 1924, a psychologist with the University of Minnesota, Carney Landis, wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of emotions were the same. Does happiness look the same on everyone? Does sadness, shock, disgust, etc. make us all react the same way facially? An interesting question for sure, but the method was strange. Basically, he recruited some student volunteers and then painted the lines of their facial muscles black. He then exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions and then of course compare the results. This is all fine, except for what the stimuli actually contained. I guess this guy just really wanted big reactions because he included showing them adult films, exposing them to ammonia, making them touch reptiles, and even beheading rats. Apparently, 1/3 of the participants willingly did this beheading when told, despite not knowing how to do it humanely, and even if they did know how to do it humanely, why would you? And for the 2/3 that were regular and did not just behead a rat because a strange man told them to, unfortunately Carney did it for them. I'm not even sure what the results of this experiment were, and I have to ask, does it even matter? What an actual nightmare for something that largely just doesn't really have an impact on our lives. In our number 6 spot today, we have telephone cats. Sorry to all the cat people out there, this one isn't going to be for you. In 1929, 2 scientists at Princeton University wanted to conduct an experiment in order order to test how auditory nerves perceive sounds. This is obviously extremely important research, but the way they went about it is very messed up. They took a sedated but alive cat and cut out part of its brain. They then attached one end of a telephone wire to the cat's auditory nerve and the other end to a receiver. When one of these scientists spoke into the cat's ear, the other one could hear it on the other end. This is cool, but most definitely not an excuse to do something so inhumane. There were benefits of this experiment, of course, and it is believed that it may have helped lead to the development of cochlear implants, which is of course an incredibly important scientific advancement. The worst part, however, while the cat actually survived this experiment, instead of treating it like a king for the rest of its life like it truly deserved, these scientists instead killed it to see if the experiment would still work on a dead cat. It didn't. In our number 5 spot today we have the Pit of Despair. This experiment was conducted by Henry Harlow and is one of the most controversial on this list. In a sort of mental health study, Henry decided to induce depression in monkeys. He took very young monkeys and separated them from their peers and mothers and put them into isolation in a cage that was called the Pit of Despair. Sometimes the monkeys would stay there for longer, more extended periods, and other times they would be repeatedly separated and put into the cage for multiple shorter stays. These monkeys all proved to be extremely psychologically disturbed after the conclusion of this experiment, which should have seemed kind of obvious even before the experiment was conducted. These monkeys were used as a model of human clinical depression, but here's where things get even sadder than they already were. These monkeys were unable to be treated and rehabilitated. Despite various forms of treatment, they were just unable to get to a place they would have been had they not have been subject to a cruel experiment. In our number 4 spot today we have psychic driving. A part of Project MKUltra, this experiment was conducted by British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, who created the psychic driving concept that the CIA found interesting. Basically, psychic driving was a procedure that subjects patients to a continuous repeated audio loop of something that is intended to change their behavior. Basically, the patients would be exposed to hundreds of thousands of repetitions of a singular statement through the course of their treatment, and they would also be subjected to paralytic drugs that would subdue them while being exposed to this looped message. Yeah, so the CIA heard about this idea for a treatment and thought, that sounds cool. Then they started sending money to fund Cameron's experiments, but he actually didn't know it was coming from the CIA because they used a front. So Cameron's psychic driving experiments for MKUltra began to take place in Canada. I guess they said that the aim of the experiments were to get rid of or cure someone of schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. I'm not sure that's how schizophrenia works, but I guess they did. Cameron would subject patients to paralytic drugs and electroconvulsive therapy that was 30 to 40 times the normal power. He would also put the experiment subjects into induced comas while exposing them to the repeated audio. The experiments were mostly conducted on patients who entered the institute from more common problems like anxiety disorders or postpartum depression, and they ended up leaving with permanent effects from his actions. These included things like urinary incontinence, amnesia, being unable to speak. Some people forgot their parents and thought that the interrogators were their parents. It clearly completely altered those who were participating in these horrible and certainly unethical experiments. In our number 3 spot today we have the UCLA schizophrenia experiments. Starting in 1983, UCLA researchers Michael Gitlin and Keith Nocherlin went to great and very unethical lengths to see just how people who were suffering from schizophrenia relapse. Basically, they were trying to figure out if there was a way to predict the relapse or a psychosis episode, and this is definitely important work that deserves attention because it could certainly have real-world benefits, but that does not mean unethical lengths should be reached. Unfortunately, this experiment involved recruiting hundreds of participants who were all being treated for schizophrenia and then taking them off of their medication. This alone has some obvious implications for the health of these people, but to make matters worse, there was no suitable plan in place for when they could return to their medication, and they also just didn't do a good enough job making sure that those participating were protected and safe given their very vulnerable state. Unfortunately, the results were disastrous and proved to be fatal when one of the participants, Antonio La Madrid, ended up taking his own life. In an article from 1994, it also says that the doctors failed to get proper informed consent from the patients as well. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Tuskegee Experiment. In the years between 1932 and 1972, there were 399 black impoverished farmers in Tuskegee, Alabama, who all had syphilis, who were recruited to participate in a free program. They were told that the program would help them treat their ailment, but of course that never happened. This experiment experiment was conducted by people who were trying to see what would happen if the disease went untreated. Instead of treating the men with penicillin, which was the recommended treatment at the time, the men received aspirin and mineral supplements as placebos. And while this experiment was conducted to try and understand what effect the spread of disease has on the body, the unethical considerations of the scientists who conducted it proved to be absolutely fatal and just downright cruel. Out of the 399, 28 of them passed away from the disease directly, 10 passed away from complications related to the disease, 40 spouses became infected, which was then passed on to 19 others at birth whose parents had been infected. This whole situation truly is one of those times where you stop and wonder how these things were ever treated as acceptable, and really just hope that things have changed for the better. In our number 1 spot today, we have Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 conducted some pretty horrifying experiments during World War II that certainly are shocking to anyone who hears about them. The experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was gruesome and just inhumane. Different medical schools and universities provided doctors and other research staff to help conduct these experiments, and they used both prisoners and civilians as the guinea pigs. There were a bunch of different experiments that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them with pathogens such as plague or cholera or anthrax. Others involved vivisection or operations with no anesthesia, putting them in a pressure chamber to see how much a human can withstand before bursting, or even live weapons testing. It is hard to even believe that this was a real thing that happened, and we honestly can't even begin to imagine what those people were forced to face during that time.
Number 10. T-Rex arms. Alright, mystery solved, folks. Have you ever wondered why a T-Rex, one of the biggest, baddest dinosaurs in the game, have you ever wondered why their arms are so tiny? What went wrong here? How did they get the short end of the DNA dino stick? Well, scientists may have an answer. They've spent decade after decade debating T-Rex arms, which first of all, it's a great job. And now, at first, previous hypotheses suggested that their arms may have been used as pectoral claspers during mating, or to get off the ground after falling over. Both hilarious in this sense. But even so, there's other parts of the body that would have been used in that scenario. So it's almost like they're still useless. New studies this year suggest that these arms getting smaller was actually perfect. The arms of the T-Rex shriveled because there is an evolutionary advantage to keeping them out of the way. T-Rex, yeah, they would eat in groups, so more often than not, these idiots would bite their friends' arms off, or their own. Yeah, so they shriveled them up, kept them out of the way, Bob's your uncle. You ever bite your own finger while you're eating food? That's a personal, embarrassing moment. Number 9, Garfield phones. Okay, hello, look who's calling. The Garfield crave began back in 1978. Jim Davis brought to life this lasagna-loving, Monday-hating cat, the OG grumpy cat, really. And as his popularity grew, of course, so did his merch. A Garfield couch with eyes, that's really anybody wants, right, in life? But the last thing you would expect to find floating in the ocean are probably Garfield phones. Also, yes, I said phones, not one phone. Thousands of Garfield phones have been slowly washing up ashore in France for 30 years now. Imagine standing there looking at the ocean, thinking about your ex, pondering life, and then a Garfield phone washes up. You're like, ugh, fine, I'll call her. This began in the 80s, but until recently, we didn't know where they were coming from, which is pretty jarring. A farmer read about these phones in an article and how they could, be hurting the environment, and he came forward and admitted he knew about the shipping container full of Garfield phones. Rene Morvin, this guy's been sitting on a national treasure, this huge secret. He says in the 80s he found the shipping container in a sea cave, which, imagine thinking you found some sort of lost billions worth of treasures, but it's just this. If the ocean gives you plastic phones, you answer it. Number 8, holes. If you have trypophobia, you may want to skip this one, I'm not gonna lie, it's pretty odd. Off the coast of Big Sur, California, a survey revealed about 15,000 holes, all underwater, just on the ocean floor. For some reason, they're all the same size and they all measure up to be around 11 meters wide and 1 meter deep. Now the team at Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, they found 15,000 of these, and they found 5,000 more that are even larger. They're called micro depressions, and the big ones are called pockmarks. Initially, scientists thought that methane under the seafloor, it was just coming out to say hello, maybe that's the reason for these indents, and then they of course left a crater. Rovers went down there, tests were done, turns out that's not the case. No methane is involved. In fact, there hasn't been any methane down there for 50,000 years. These MDs are essentially garbage trails, and now there's deep sea creatures living in them. It's like a little underwater neighborhood. It's cute. They even found a whale skull just laying in one of them. Can you imagine that? Imagine being a crab and coming home to that. I'd move. I'd move to the next micro depression immediately. Number 7. Amelia Earhart remains. The first woman to fly across the Atlantic was well on her way to setting even more groundbreaking records, but her plane tragically disappeared over the Pacific in 1937. And it's since been a great mystery where the final resting place of Amelia Earhart now is. But we may have actually found her remains back in 1940 without really knowing. They were found on the Pacific island of Nikumaroro. Now, the initial examination of these remains were reported to be that of a man. That was the general idea in 1941. Come 2018, however, now we have a different idea. Could it be? Researcher Richard Johns took another look at the long-lost remains, and since those days, we've learned more about Amelia Earhart. Photos have since surfaced online, so we compared the bone measurements to her body type, and they're pretty sure that they found our missing aviator. Number 6. Abandoned whiskey. This one's pretty fun, dare I say, a little exciting? I don't know. An explorer found crates in a hut belonging to another explorer, that of Ernest Shackleton. You've probably heard of him before, it's pretty huge. Anything belonging to our boy Ernest Shackleton is a treasure, especially when it's frozen bottles of scotch. That's pretty lovely. It's probably the best case scenario, really, evidently. It's 2010, and you find 100-year-old frozen scotch that Ernest Shackleton once drank. What do? Do you drink it? Do you save it? A little bit of both. I would do a bit of both. This may be the best discovery on this list, or at least the happiest. It's been locked up, of course, since, such a historical find, but you'll be happy to know that a sample was given to Scottish distiller White & Mackay. They're now studying this recipe to try and bring it back to life, which is amazing. Number 5. Surprise Nikes. I threw shoes on my holiday wish list this year, and every year for that matter. Nothing like a nice fresh pair of sneaks. Sometimes you find the perfect shoes, and sometimes they find you. In the mid-90s, a shipment of Nike shoes heading to the US was lost during this crazy storm. Around 5 shipping containers fell into the sea, so later on, 61,000 pairs of shoes just started to drift towards the west coast. Just making their little way, just slowly but surely. That's terrifying. People saw shoes in the water. Do you know how afraid I would be if a shoe brushed against my shoulder while I was swimming? My brain would go to the darkest places. So scary. These shoes luckily didn't belong to anybody, but they did all have the same serial number by chance. So what started as this ocean mystery ended up working out for the better. Nike lost a lot of money, and we tracked the shoe's journey. So now we oddly learned more about our ocean currents. Well, Nike lost money. Win-win. Number 4. 2021 rocket. Remember last year in May when a large piece of space junk was just going to crash land somewhere on Earth and we had no idea where it was going to hit? Possible Avengers level threat. We're all just looking at Twitter, refreshing, like, where's it going to be? Where did it land? Well, at the time, this was one of the biggest pieces of human-made space junk to ever crash towards Earth, so it was a little jarring. They said it would land in New York or New Zealand. One of the two. Okay, gamble. Let's do it. 50-50. The debris came from the lost March 5B rocket and landed in the Indian Ocean, luckily, with most of it burning up upon re-entry. Now, usually when rockets discard pieces, it's done so strategically, falling into the ocean, normally the Atlantic, in a graveyard. This was not supposed to happen. Thankfully, it didn't land in New York. That, again, would have been terrifying. It would look like Loki's arrived. What's that? Is that a meteor? Are we done? Number 3. Raining spiders. Back in 2015, and you guessed it, Australia, residents of Goulburn woke up to the town just being caked in spiders. This is my nightmare. This is my absolute biggest fear. Everything was webbed. They were tiny black spiderlings all over the place. Resident Ian Watson told reporters that, quote, "When I looked up at the sun, it was like this tunnel of webs going up for a couple of 100 meters into the sky." End quote. Also, delete memory. Thanks. Rick Vedder, an entomologist at the University of California at Riverside, says that many spiders are just ballooning around us, but thankfully, they all don't do it at the same time. Like this situation. Yeah, this is happening all the time, so keep your heads up. Or down. I'd rather not look. Number 2. Giant pipes. Back in 2017, these massive industrial pipes washed up along the shores of the northern Norfolk coast. Now, if I was swimming and I saw this thing floating towards me, I would faint. I would think it's a giant sea snake or something. I would have no idea what I was looking at. These things were massive. Terrible discovery, but again, pretty exciting. I didn't realize how big these were at first, and then I zoomed in. I think I have some mechanophobia now. Where did they come from? Well, these pipes were lost at sea following an accident on an Iceland shipping container, which resulted in 500-meter-long pipes coming loose. Yeah, that's so scary. Luckily, you can see these things coming, but that's still jarring. I would think it's a submarine emerging out of the water. God. The company that produced them, Pipe Life, great name, rather fitting, They urge the curious to stay far away. Do not approach them. You can see them coming because they're the size of buildings, so they can obviously easily crush a human being. These ocean pipes have a diameter of 2 meters, and the longest one that washed up on the beach was 500 meters long. Number 1. 3 kittens. Back in 2020, an oil worker named Drayton Dewich found 3 kittens all frozen to the ground near Drayton Valley. They were alive, but just, very cold. It was mid-January, everything is frozen. This was near an oil well that he'd been working on, right? Those are always freezing cold. On Facebook, they posted about how the 3 kittens were all males, dewormed and living under the same roof now, and they were much warmer. He just found 3 little pets and brought them home. He got them out of the ice by using coffee to melt the ice. That's amazing. I said it once before and I'll say it again. Coffee saves lives. He's like, oh yeah, look at that. They're alive.
Number 10. John Mack. In the early 90s, a Pulitzer Prize winning psychologist named Dr. John E. Mack made the jump from diagnosing ordinary psychological conditions to researching apparent alien abductees and their stories and experiences surrounding UFOs. Yep, Google it up. It's actually terrifying and very real. Apparently, cases studied by Mack and abductions sometimes get involved with hypnosis. This guy was a tenured professor since the 50s at Harvard. He did his research. The UFO abduction rabbit hole led him to interviewing and studying more than 200 people who insist that they were taken. At first, he was trying to crack the psychosis of the subject, but after studying and funding from the Rockefellers, private donors, and universities, he wrote numerous books on the phenomena and its strangeness. Again, tenured and Pulitzer Prize winner. He sadly passed in 2004 from a drunk driver. His life and death holds heavy conspiracy debate around it. Check it out. It's a little bit strange. Number 9. Sophia. We've seen her on Fallon, we've seen her on breakfast television. She still looks like a bad cyberpunk character, doesn't she? Sophia by Hanson Robotics, the most advanced human-like robot that we have. Well, actually, this is like their 12th one. This is the world's first robot citizen. Literally. Not only is she considered a citizen, she has a credit card and a seat in the UN. Like what? In 2016, Sophia premiered on the Jimmy Fallon Show playing rock, paper, scissors. Yeah, simple stuff. 2 years later, she's harmonizing with Jimmy live. Also, they didn't sing Mr. Roboto. Like, I just feel like that was a huge missed opportunity there. Like, where are the writers, dude? I've seen the Terminator and Ex Machina, and at the Web Summit presentation in 2018, Sophia and her brother Han glitched out on stage and had a terrifying, cryptic, non-coherent conversation, joking about ending the world. Yeah, it's horrifying. You gotta check it out. Dude, I feel like Furbies were their first try, and now they got these like Brat Dolls mini Sophias coming out soon. Like, where's this going? Number 8. Arthur Flowerdew. James Arthur Flowerdew was born in England in 1906. Grew up, paid his taxes, lived a pretty normal life. At about the age of 12, he began to have strange recurring dreams and hallucinations, though, over time crystallizing into a very clear and vivid image. Dreams riddled with stone cities, carvings in cliffs, and vast deserts. He didn't understand what it all meant. One day, as an old man, he was watching a documentary on the BBC on the ancient city of Petra in Jordan. He was stunned. This was the city he had always seen. He called the BBC and asked them to interview him. Archaeological experts and the Jordanian government even invited him to come out to Jordan, where he continued to even baffle experts. Flowerdew was able to find his way around the city without a map, giving precise details on landmarks and even pointing out undiscovered locations. Yeah, here's the scary part. After all of this, he was convinced that he had lived an entire previous life in ancient times and was reincarnated in the 20th century. Number 7. Proctor's Ledge. Over 1,000 documents from Salem's witch trials, yet none of the accounts actually specify where the hangings took place. For more than 300 years, it was believed that the 19 people who were accused, tried, and executed in the Salem witch trials of 1692 were hanged at the summit of Gallows Hill. Maps of 1700 Salem show Gallows Hill marked out, but no actual marker of the execution site. That's odd. A team of researchers began to reconsider the evidence in 2010 and eventually concluded it was the right spot. Yeah, oopsies. Actually, the real execution spot was called Proctor's Ledge. Also, eerie name for where they hang people, isn't it? It was confirmed in 2016 by scientists after ground-penetrating data and writings from 1692 that it wasn't the actual location of the brutality. I know what you're thinking. It's named after John Proctor. No, it's not. However, really odd timing, as he was one of the witches accused of witchcraft. Locals say that the ghost named the Lady in White visits Proctor's Ledge often, which now makes sense with the whole "we found the right spot" stuff. Visitors claim to have caught sightings of her and even catch her disembodied voice. Yeah. Number 6. Props. Elmer McCurdy was an American outlaw, running with a small crew, banking and train robbing the Wild West until he was killed in a shootout with sheriffs after robbing a Katy train in Oklahoma in 1911. Famously known as the bandit who wouldn't give up, his mummified body was first put on display at an Oklahoma funeral home before being an amusement, traveling carnival show to carnival show during the 1920s right through the 1960s. After changing ownership several times, McCurdy's remains eventually wound up at the Pike Amusement Zone in Long Beach, California. His corpse was then used as a prop, but then discovered by a film crew on a set of The $6 Million Man. They were positively identified in 1976, and the following year, in 1977, Elmer McCurdy's body was finally laid to rest at the Summit View Cemetery in Oklahoma. McCurdy's fingers were apparently so damaged that detectives couldn't even pull a fingerprint. The coroners had to x-ray his teeth and measure his bones to ID him. His pockets included a bullet, a Sunny Amusement Museum of Crime ticket, a newspaper article, and a 1924 penny. Yeah, that's terrible. Just weekend at Bernieing him for like 60 years set to set, not really knowing it's a real body? People will do anything for money, won't they? Number 5. Operation High Jump. Operation High Jump, officially named the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, launched in 1946 to 1947, an operation to establish an Antarctic research base organized by Admiral Richard E. Byrd. High Jump included 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircrafts. The war's end signaled the onset of the atomic age and a desire to secure supplies of uranium. With its almost unlimited mineral deposits, the largely unexplored territory of Antarctica was just the prize. It commenced 1946 and ended in late 1947. Or did it? Also known as Task Force 68, Byrd and his team established the Little America 4 base near 3 previous bases in the ice. The frozen aircrafts would photograph as much of the Antarctic's land surface as possible during this 3-month operation. Seems like the public thinks that High Jump could have been more fishy than we think. Seems like skeptics are leaning towards more of a secret military expedition to the center of the Earth type stuff. Yep. Apparently there's a mouth to the center of the planet in the Antarctic, and there was a secret race to find it. High Jump is still today at the mercy of the internet on whether or not it was a legit project or a secretly funded scientific expedition. Google it up. It's pretty wild and very real. Number 4. Ouija boards. Popularized by teens in the 1970s, the Ouija board has earned its reputation over the years. Created almost 100 years before its heightened popularity, the year is 1891, and as the first ads started to appear in papers claiming, quote, Ouija, the wonderful talking board, the title from a Pittsburgh toy and novelty shop. The first paper described it as a magical game that answered questions about the past, present, and future with marvelous accuracy. A flat board with the letters of the alphabet configured in 2 semicircles. Above, the numbers 0 through 9, the words yes and no in the upper corners, goodbye at the bottom. No batteries included nor needed. Now, the origins are pretty messy, and it's hard to kind of pinpoint who or what inspired these early attempts at this game. It kind of just appeared on shelves. No, literally. The Kennard Novelty Company exclusively made and marketed these talking boards, and apparently the lore goes that one of the designer's sisters was a medium and asked the board what it would like to be called. It responded, Ouija, followed by good luck. Well, that's absolutely terrifying. At least good sportsmanship though, right? Yeah, I've never played with one of these, nor will I ever. That's a no-brainer for me, 100%. Number 3, the Philadelphia Experiment. I pray that this one is a hoax because there's a lot of documents that relate to this subject around the time that don't really seem to add up. The Philadelphia Experiment was an alleged event witnessed by Carl Allen and the United States Navy shipyard in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in October 1943. Allen describes an experiment where the US Navy attempted to render itself invisible, cloaking the destroyer the USS Eldridge, and the bizarre scientific results that followed. On Allen's account, the destroyer successfully made itself invisible, but the ship inexplicably teleported to Norfolk, Virginia for several minutes and then reappeared back in Philly. Sounds pretty cool, right? So what's the catch? The ship's crew was supposed to have suffered various side effects, including insanity, intangibility, and being frozen in place. Like people stuck in the walls and stuff. Stuck in the floors like this is a scene from Jumanji. Terrifying. The story surfaced in the late 1950s when Allen sent a book full of handwritten letters referring to the experiment to a US Navy research organization. The US Navy maintains that there has been no such experiment ever conducted and that the details are highly exaggerated and falsified. Dude, I hope so, because this is horrifying. Number 2. Wow. In a 1959 paper, Cornell University physicists speculated that if an extraterrestrial civilization was attempting to communicate with us using radio signals, that they might use a frequency of 1420 megahertz, which is naturally emitted by hydrogen, the most common element in the universe. In 1973, Ohio State University assigned the Big Ear to the scientific search for extraterrestrial intelligence. 1977, Jerry Amon, a SETI volunteer astronomer, was analyzing data and spots a series of signal intensities and frequencies that left him and his colleagues astonished. The WOW signal was the first signal detected from Earth. The signal came from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. Amon discovered the anomaly. Impressed by the result, on the computer printout he circled 6EQUJ5 and wrote 3 letters beside it. Wow. Leading to the event's famous name. The signal lasted for a full 72 seconds, and it remains today as the strongest candidate for an ET radio transmission ever detected. And number 1, of course, the USS Cyclops. Launched in May of 1910, the USS Cyclops was a Protus-class collier built for the United States Navy, a huge cargo ship designed for transporting coal. In 1918, the cursed vessel left Rio de Janeiro, heading for Barbados, right around a certain dangerous triangle. Unfortunately, the Voyager was never to be seen again. Named Cyclops after a race of giants from Greek mythology, she was huge and heavy, unmissable by the naked eye. So what happened to her? The loss of the ship and crew still remains the single largest loss of life at sea the United States Navy has ever experienced. Funny thing is, it went right through the Bermuda Triangle, a place where magnetic compasses stop working, ships are never heard from again, and of course the military still refuses to operate and research. Skeptics are quick to say aliens and black holes, but the magnetism surrounding the Bermuda Triangle cases might be a logical explanation. I think they still owe us some explanations, no? I'm looking at you, Freedom of Information Act.